The calendar marked February 13th, 1258, a date that would forever be etched in the collective memory of humanity as the beginning of the end. Inside the magnificent palace of Baghdad, a structure that had stood as a testament to 36 years of Caliph al-Mustasim's reign, an eerie phenomenon occurred. The gentle, rhythmic murmur of the water fountains suddenly fell silent. For centuries, these elaborate water features, fed by ingenious canal systems, had provided the soundtrack to the Islamic Golden Age. Their sudden stillness was the first harbinger of an approaching catastrophe, a physical manifestation of the city's lifeblood being severed. In Baghdad, the jewel of the medieval world, scholars from across the horizon gathered to access the House of Wisdom, the largest repository of human knowledge ever assembled. But on this day, the air, once blessed by the flow of water and the hum of intellectual discourse, grew heavy with the weight of an unnatural silence that echoed through the corridors of power. This silence was the only truth left. Just beyond the towering city walls, the horizon had been utterly consumed by the presence of the Mongol army, a force unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened warriors, having emerged from the harsh, nomadic silence of the Central Asian steppes, now encircled the capital like an endless sea of horses and men. This was an army that did not comprehend the value of urban civilization, the beauty of philosophical debate, or the sanctity of written knowledge. They were a people of the sword, understanding only the brutal vocabulary of absolute conquest. Their reputation, a dark shadow of terror, preceded them, whispering tales of cities erased and populations turned to dust. Now, only 7 days remained before a civilization that had stood proud and unbroken for 8 centuries would be violently erased from the stage of history. The horror that awaited Baghdad would send shockwaves throughout the world. But the true tragedy lay not just in the fall of the walls, but in what followed. The treatment of the Caliph, his wife, and his children would leave an indelible stain on the annals of human history. The Mongols' purpose extended far beyond simple military victory. They aimed to make an example so terrifying that the mere memory of it would serve as a weapon of psychological warfare for generations. The brutality was so extreme and deliberately calculated that even the Persian court historians who witnessed the events found themselves unable or unwilling to commit the full, harrowing truth to paper until much later. We now excavate these dark chambers of history, using desperate letters from Venetian merchants, fragmentary Mongol records, and dusty Persian manuscripts written in trembling script by those who saw the unthinkable. To comprehend the magnitude of this destruction, one must look at the man at the center of the storm, al-Mustasim. He was no ordinary political figure. He was the 37th Caliph in an unbroken line of the Abbasid dynasty, considered by millions to be the shadow of God upon earth. His empire once stretched from the shores of Spain to the coasts of India, but the Abbasid line had grown old, and its vigor had diminished, replaced by a dangerous arrogance. Al-Mustasim himself embodied this decline, preferring palace luxuries and the flattery of sycophantic courtiers over the harsh demands of governance. While he spent his days immersed in ceremony, he convinced himself that his sacred titles and tradition would protect him from any earthly danger. Even as Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon and refugee reports of 40 erased cities flooded in, he clung to fatal misconceptions. The Caliph believed, with a delusional certainty, that the Mongols would recognize his divine authority and bow to the will of heaven. He could not conceive that anyone would dare violate his sacred position. In his worldview, Baghdad was so holy that its fall was simply impossible. It was the beating heart of science, art, and culture. But al-Mustasim was facing Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a commander who led an army that had become a natural disaster, obliterating everything in its path. The Mongols had crushed armies 10 times their size through superior discipline and a ruthlessness that defied comprehension. In every land they touched, rivers ran red with blood, and they constructed grotesque warning towers built from the severed heads of their enemies. Hulagu dispatched a clear, merciless message to the Caliph: if you surrender immediately, your life will be spared. If you resist, your city will be ground into dust, your palaces reduced to ashes, and your family will suffer consequences beyond imagination." Al-Mustasim responded with dismissive laughter, dripping with contempt, declaring that God would never abandon him. But the plans of fate were different. When the assault began on January 29, 1258, the Mongols brought advanced siege technology, including early gunpowder weapons and Chinese engineers who turned killing into a science. The ancient walls were subjected to a relentless bombardment that shook the earth. By February 5th, the outer walls were breached, and by the 10th day, organized resistance was broken. On February 13th, Hulagu Khan strode into the Abbasid throne room. The man who believed himself untouchable now knelt in the dust, his golden robes torn and soiled. The divine shield he trusted in had been lifted, leaving only a terrified, defeated man facing his conquerors. As the Caliph attempted to beg for mercy, Hulagu regarded him with cold curiosity and posed a devastating question: "Where is your God now?" The Mongol leader laughed and added a cruel mockery: "Since you loved treasure so much, let us see if gold will sustain you." At that moment, the Mongols forced the Caliph to consume his own treasury, filling his mouth with gold coins and silver pieces until his teeth cracked and his body rebelled in agony. This was merely the opening act of a week that would irreversibly alter the fate of the Islamic world. The air inside the great throne room of the Abbasid palace, which for 800 years had been thick with the scent of ambergris and the whispers of poets, now carried only the metallic stench of blood and the acrid smoke of a burning empire. Al-Mustasim, the 37th Caliph, and the man considered by millions to be the shadow of God upon earth, lay prostrate on the very marble floor his ancestors had polished with their pride. Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, sat upon the golden throne with the detached scientific curiosity of a predator examining prey that had finally fallen into a long-prepared trap. Outside, the 7-day clock of Baghdad's existence was ticking toward zero. But inside these walls, the Mongols were preparing a spectacle of symbolic cruelty designed to be a weapon of psychological warfare for generations to come. The ritual of humiliation began with a question that shattered what remained of the Caliph's dignity: "Where is your God now? Where is the divine protection you were promised?" As Al-Mustasim's lips moved in a silent prayer, or perhaps were paralyzed by sheer terror, no sound emerged to defend his 8th-century lineage. Hulagu laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth, and declared that since the Caliph loved his treasure more than the welfare of his people or the defense of his city, he should be sustained by that very wealth. At a sharp command, Mongol warriors began dragging the massive chests of the imperial treasury into the center of the hall. Gold coins, silver ingots, and sacred relics that had been accumulated over centuries were piled high before the defeated ruler. What followed was one of the most humiliating scenes in recorded history. In an act of deliberate symbolic cruelty, the Mongols forced the Caliph to consume the treasure he had valued above all else. Strong hands seized Al-Mustasim, forcing his mouth open as gold coins were shoved past his lips. Silver pieces were pushed between his teeth until the metal burned his throat, and his teeth literally cracked under the pressure. As his body rebelled violently against this metallic feast, the captors showed no mercy, beating him back into submission whenever he resisted. This torment was deliberately prolonged for hours. The Mongols would not permit the Caliph to lose consciousness or die before the spectacle of his greed's consequences was complete. Even as his stomach distended painfully and his body suffered internal trauma, Hulagu ensured the shadow of God felt every second of his fall from grace. But this grotesque banquet was merely the opening act of the night's horrors. Hulagu understood that to truly erase a civilization, one must not only kill its leader, but also destroy its future and its spirit. He ordered that the royal family be brought forward, the Caliph's 3 sons and 4 daughters. The first to be summoned was Princess Fatima, the 27-year-old eldest daughter. She was a woman who represented the absolute height of Islamic scholarship, fluent in 5 languages, and a celebrated poet whose works were admired across many lands. She had grown up believing in the transformative power of knowledge and the sanctity of the written word. Now she was forced to her knees in the dust of the throne room, right in front of her helpless, gold-choked father. The treatment Princess Fatima suffered was so horrific that contemporary Persian chroniclers like Rashid al-Din struggled to commit the full truth to paper, using only oblique references to hint at the tragedy. Witnessed by her own father, the systematic destruction of the princess was a calculated message. The most powerful man in the Islamic world could not protect even his own blood from the raw power of the steppes. Here was a repository of learning and culture, a woman of letters, reduced to nothing by men who saw refinement as a weakness to be exploited. When the ordeal was finished, she could no longer be counted among the living, and her father was left to witness the total bankruptcy of his supposed divine favor. As the shadows lengthened in the palace, the 3 princes were led in: 23-year-old Mubarak, 21-year-old Ahmed, and 14-year-old Ali. They were young men who, only days before, were heirs to an empire stretching across continents, yet now they stood in chains before their executioner. Hulagu observed them with a detached gaze, repeating his devastating question about the lack of divine intervention for the house of Abbas. Prince Mubarak, drawing upon the last reserves of family pride, stepped forward and spoke of a delayed justice that would surely come from God. Hulagu merely nodded, as if acknowledging a student who had correctly recited a useless lesson, and gave the order for the final movement of this tragic symphony. In Mongol tradition, spilling noble blood directly upon the ground was believed to bring curses and misfortune upon the land. To avoid this supernatural danger, they had perfected methods of execution that were no less fatal, but left no blood visible to the earth. Large, heavy carpets were brought into the blood-stained throne room. One by one, the 3 princes were wrapped tightly within these fabrics and bound so thoroughly that movement and even shallow breathing became nearly impossible. Then, systematically and methodically, the Mongol guards began to beat the princes to death through the layers of fabric. The carpets served to muffle their final cries and ensure that not a single drop of royal blood stained the floor. By the time the carpets were unrolled, the future of the 800-year dynasty had been silenced forever, leaving al-Mustasim to face his own end as the last of his line. The air inside the throne room was thick with the finality of a dying era. Hulagu Khan had already systematically dismantled the caliph's pride, his wealth, and his family. The 3 princes, Mubarak, Ahmed, and the 14-year-old Ali, lay motionless after their agonizing execution inside the heavy carpets. Al-Mustasim had been forced to witness the light leave the eyes of his children, his spirit now as soiled as his golden robes. But Hulagu, ever the strategist of terror, desired a final curtain that would match the symbolic weight of the 800-year-old Abbasid dynasty. He did not want a mere execution. He wanted a ritual that would prove, once and for all, that the shadow of God was nothing more than a man beneath the boots of the Mongol Empire. Following the same ancient tradition used for his sons, the Caliph was ordered to be wrapped tightly in heavy carpets. This was not out of mercy, but to ensure that his noble blood would not touch and curse the ground. Bound securely in the dark, airless confinement of the fabric, al-Mustasim was placed on the floor. However, his end was designed with a unique, macabre flair. A sturdy wooden platform was constructed and positioned directly over the carpet-bound ruler. Then, in a display of absolute dominance, Hulagu and his generals arranged a grand victory feast upon this very platform. As the man trapped below slowly suffocated, unable to move or even cry out for help, the Mongol commanders ate roasted meat and drank wine at the table above him. They laughed and celebrated their conquest, their weight pressing the platform and the carpet down a little more firmly with every shift and every shout. While the victors cheered, the last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad drew his final, labored breaths in the suffocating darkness beneath their feet. The feast continued through the night, a celebration of raw power over divine pretension. When the first light of dawn broke and the celebration ended, the carpet was unrolled to reveal a face frozen in a permanent expression of horror and asphyxiation. There was no wound, no blood, only the unmistakable marks of a civilization that had been crushed into silence. But the death of the caliph was merely the signal for a much larger tragedy. With the sacred authority of the Islamic world literally crushed, the city of Baghdad now lay utterly defenseless. The gates were thrown wide, and the Mongol army spread through the neighborhoods like a wildfire consuming dry timber. The massacre that followed was a mechanical process of elimination. No distinction was made between the elderly, women, or children. Scholars who had spent their lives in the House of Wisdom were slaughtered alongside merchants in the markets and imams praying in the mosques. The streets, once the pride of the world, became so choked with the bodies of the fallen that horses could no longer pass through the thoroughfares. According to the most reliable contemporary estimates, nearly 1,000 people, perhaps even more, were killed during the sacking of the city. The Mongol purpose was not just to rule, but to break Baghdad so completely that the very idea of resistance would become unthinkable for generations. They moved methodically, house by house and street by street. Those who sought sanctuary in the mosques were killed while in prayer, their blood staining the floors where they had come seeking divine protection. Survivors reported that the ground literally turned to mud from the sheer volume of blood spilling into the dirt. By the third day of the massacre, the entire city began to smell of decomposing flesh under the relentless heat. Particular targets of the Mongol wrath were the bearers of knowledge, doctors, astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers. In the Mongol worldview, knowledge was power, and therefore it was a threat that had to be neutralized. The legendary House of Wisdom, which had preserved the intellectual heritage of the Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Chinese, was set ablaze. The flames were visible for miles, a funeral pyre for centuries of human progress. Priceless manuscripts and scientific treatises were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that multiple accounts state the water changed color, first turning black from the ink of countless books, then running red as the blood of the city's inhabitants joined the flow. One survivor, a scholar named Ibn al-Fuati, managed to hide in a well for 3 days without food or water, listening to the screams and the sounds of destruction above. When he finally emerged, he found that the city he knew had ceased to exist. The streets were carpeted with the dead, and packs of wild dogs moved freely, feeding on the remains of a civilization. The only sounds left in the city that once hosted the brightest minds on earth were the buzzing of flies and the distant fading cries of the dying. The Mongols had delivered their message. The old world was dead, and a new, colder reality had arrived. As the fires in the royal palace began to smolder into gray ash, a different, more profound darkness descended upon the streets of Baghdad. The Mongols, having already extinguished the political life of the Abbasid dynasty and crushed its leadership, now turned their cold, methodical attention to the intellectual soul of the Islamic world. The legendary House of Wisdom, along with hundreds of smaller libraries and private collections scattered throughout the metropolis, became the next targets of a systematic purge. For more than 500 years, these institutions had served as the world's most unparalleled repository of human thought, housing scientific treatises, philosophical debates, and literary achievements that had no equal in the medieval world. Within these walls lay the accumulated wisdom of the Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Chinese, all translated, preserved, and expanded upon by generations of scholars. Now, in a matter of days, this irreplaceable heritage was marked for total, violent erasure. The Mongol soldiers, who viewed urban civilization with suspicion and the written word as a potential weapon of the elite, began the physical liquidation of knowledge. They did not see books as treasures. They saw them as fuel or waste. Massive bonfires were ignited in the courtyards of the great mosque and the squares of the city, fueled by handwritten manuscripts that had taken entire lifetimes of calligraphers to produce. The flames of the House of Wisdom burned for several days and nights, creating a pillar of smoke that was visible for miles across the Mesopotamian plains. Original works on medicine that described the circulation of blood, astronomical charts that mapped the stars with 99% accuracy, and mathematical theories that would not be rediscovered in Europe for 400 years were tossed into the inferno by men who could neither read nor right. What the fire did not consume, the waters of the Tigris River were forced to swallow. In an act of staggering logistical cruelty that would haunt the collective memory of humanity, the Mongols began dumping thousands of volumes into the river to serve as a makeshift bridge or simply to dispose of the clutter of the conquered. According to multiple contemporary accounts from survivors, the volume of manuscripts was so immense that the river itself underwent a terrifying transformation. First, the water turned a deep obsidian black, as the ink from millions of pages dissolved into the current. Later, as the massacre of the city's inhabitants reached its peak along the riverbanks, the black ink mingled with the blood of the fallen, turning the Tigris into a dark, purple stream of death. There is a haunting legend, recorded by historians of the era, that a Mongol warrior was able to cross the wide Tigris on horseback by walking over a bridge formed entirely of floating, waterlogged books. One soldier, seeing the dark ink stains on his horse's legs after the crossing, reportedly joked that even the water was trying to become educated. This merciless joke encapsulates the conquerors' total contempt for the civilization they were dismantling. They viewed themselves as a force of nature, an unstoppable storm that had no need for the weakness of philosophy or the distraction of poetry. By the end of the week, the Tigris had carried away the intellectual foundations of the Golden Age, leaving the survivors in a world without a history. The psychological impact of this loss was immeasurable and irreversible. For the few who escaped the sword, the destruction of the libraries meant the death of their collective memory. One such survivor, the scholar Ibn al-Fuati, managed to endure by hiding in the darkness of a deep well for 3 days without food, listening to the screams of his colleagues and the crackling of burning parchment above him. When he finally emerged, too weak to stand, he found a landscape that was no longer recognizable as a city of men. He described the streets as being carpeted with the dead, where the only sounds were the buzzing of millions of flies and the heavy panting of wild dogs feeding on the remains of the elite. The sophisticated canal systems, once the marvel of hydraulic engineering, were now clogged with a mixture of corpses and discarded scrolls. By the end of the 7th day, Baghdad, the city that had once hosted the most vibrant intellectual debates in human history, had fallen into a state of absolute tomb-like silence. There was no longer the rhythmic sound of book pages turning in the quiet alcoves of the House of Wisdom, no poetry being recited in the perfumed gardens, and no call to prayer echoing from the heights of the minarets. The Mongols did not stay to rebuild the bridges or restore the libraries. Their goal was to deliver a message of absolute crushing power. Baghdad was no longer a living city. It was now a hollowed-out shell, a bloody warning marker on the map of history designed to terrorize any other nation that dared to think its culture made it invincible. As the Mongol war machine prepared to march further westward towards Syria and Egypt, they left behind a graveyard of both people and ideas that would take 500 years to even begin to recover. The catastrophic fall of Baghdad in February 1258 was not merely the end of a single city, it was a seismic shift that permanently altered the geography of power and the psychological state of the medieval world. As the Mongol fires continued to smolder in the ruins of the House of Wisdom, those few who managed to survive the initial 7 days of slaughter began a desperate and historic exodus. This was a flight of the broken and the brilliant alike. Doctors, astronomers, mathematicians, and poets, who had once been the pride of the caliph's court, were now refugees carrying nothing but their traumatic memories and a few salvaged fragments of manuscripts hidden beneath their robes. They moved in hushed, terrified groups across the scorching deserts, heading toward the only remaining bastions of stability in the Islamic world, Cairo, Damascus, and Samarkand. This mass migration of intellect meant that while Baghdad lay in ruins, its seeds were being scattered into new soil, forever changing the cultural landscape of the Middle East. In Cairo, the Mamluk Sultanate watched the approach of these refugees with a mixture of horror and strategic preparation. The stories the survivors brought with them were almost too terrible to believe, sounding like descriptions of the apocalypse. They spoke of the Tigris River running black with the ink of 1,000,000 destroyed books, and then running red with the blood of 1,000,000 citizens. They described the final, humiliating moments of Al-Mustasim, the shadow of God, crushed beneath a wooden platform while his conquerors feasted and drank wine above him. These narratives circulated like a dark curse, traveling faster than the Mongol horses could march. For the rulers of Egypt and Syria, the fall of Baghdad served as the final warning. The era of open, confident borders and philosophical optimism was over. The realization that even the greatest city on earth could be erased in a single week led to a fundamental change in the behavior of all surviving states. City walls that had been neglected for decades were suddenly reinforced and thickened until they became formidable, mountain-like structures. The defensive, cautious posture that would characterize the post-1258 era began to take root in the architecture and the collective psychology of the people. Libraries, once the vibrant centers of public life and open debate, began to be hidden in secret locations or fortified like military installations to prevent a second murder of knowledge. The trauma of Baghdad's destruction created a visible scar on the civilization. The boundless curiosity of the Golden Age was replaced by a grim, existential determination to survive at any cost. Survivors who reached distant villages in Aleppo or the high courts of Cairo passed down their accounts in whispers, ensuring that the memory of the atrocity remained alive even if the documents had perished. They spoke of the names of the fallen princes, 23-year-old Mubarak, 21-year-old Ahmed, and the 14-year-old Ali, ensuring that their lineage was remembered by history, even if their dynasty was effectively dead. The Mongol war machine, fueled by this constant forward momentum and the psychological weapon of Baghdad's total destruction, continued its westward march towards Syria and Egypt. The tactic of absolute brutality proved devastatingly effective. Hearing of the caliph's fate in excruciating detail, many other regional rulers chose to surrender without firing a single arrow. They opened their gates, offered immense tribute, and accepted Mongol sovereignty just to avoid sharing the fate of Baghdad. In this way, the sacrificial blood of the Iraqi capital bought a temporary, terrified peace for its neighbors. However, the Mongol Empire itself, though seemingly invincible, was beginning to show the first subtle signs of internal friction that would eventually lead to its fragmentation into competing khanates. Even as they stood at the height of their territorial power, the conquerors could not foresee that the memory of the city they had burned would outlast the unified empire they were building. By the end of this great displacement, the axis of the Islamic world had shifted permanently away from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Baghdad remained a silent cemetery, its sophisticated canal systems filled with the debris of a lost age, and its bustling markets replaced by the buzzing of flies over ruins. The lesson taught by the Mongols was stark and unavoidable. Power and glory are not permanent states, but temporary conditions that must be actively and realistically maintained. The stories of the survivors, such as the scholar Ibn al-Fuati, who spent 3 days in a dark well, became the foundational texts of a new, more somber history. These men and women did not just carry books, they carried the weight of a world that had vanished overnight. In the refugee camps outside Cairo, a new generation grew up hearing about the Black Tigris, learning that knowledge is as fragile as a scrap of parchment in a storm. This displacement ensured that while the physical city was gone, the intellectual fire of Baghdad would eventually light the way for other centers of learning, though the flame would always burn with the memory of the smoke that once covered Iraq. The Mongols could destroy the buildings, but the displacement proved they could not catch every soul that fled with the truth. The fires that had consumed Baghdad eventually dimmed, leaving behind a landscape that was more a graveyard than a city. The Mongol army, having completed its 7-day ritual of systematic destruction, did not stay to rebuild or establish a permanent administration in the ruins. Instead, they continued their relentless westward march towards Syria and Egypt, for the Mongol war machine required constant forward momentum to sustain itself. Behind them, they left a warning marker that would terrorize the world for generations. Baghdad, once the beating heart of civilization, was now a hollowed shell, its bustling markets silent, and its sophisticated canal systems filled with the remains of a lost age. For the first time in centuries, the call to prayer did not echo from the minarets, and the sound of turning pages was replaced by the rustle of ash in the wind. The lesson that history presents through this tragedy is both stark and unavoidable. The fall of the Abbasid dynasty proved that even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable when they trust in past glories rather than present realities. Al-Mustasim had believed his sacred titles would grant him immortality, trusting in divine favor while neglecting the practical necessity of defense. His faith in an unchanging order proved to be a fatal blindness. The story of Baghdad teaches us that power and glory are not permanent states. They are temporary conditions that must be actively maintained. The moment a society begins to believe in its own invincibility is the precise moment it becomes most fragile. Though the city fell and its libraries were burned, the Mongols could never truly conquer memory itself. The survivors, scattering across the known world to Cairo, Damascus, and distant villages, carried the narrative of those final days with them. They spoke in hushed tones about the 1,000,000 dead, the destruction of the House of Wisdom, and the symbolic execution of the Caliph beneath the Mongol feast. These stories served as a psychological shield for other regions. Hearing what befell Baghdad, many rulers surrendered without resistance to avoid a similar fate. Thus, the tragedy of one city paid the price for the survival of an entire region, even as the center of Islamic learning shifted permanently to other capitals. Over time, even the mighty Mongol Empire began to fragment, splitting into competing khanates and eventually being absorbed into the very cultures they had once conquered. Yet the scar of 1258 remained visible in the subsequent behavior of Islamic states. Openness and confidence gave way to a defensive, cautious posture. City walls became thicker, and libraries were fortified like military installations. The trauma fundamentally changed the course of Middle Eastern history, shifting its axis forever. The Golden Age did not end in a single night, but its spirit was irrevocably altered by the sight of the Black and Red Tigris. The reason we recount these terrible events today is not to foster hatred or reopen old wounds. It is because some truths are so devastating that they must not be allowed to fade into comfortable forgetfulness. If we allow these lessons to disappear from our collective memory, history has a disturbing tendency to repeat its darkest chapters in new forms. When historians speak of the fall of Baghdad, they often use abstract numbers: 1,000 dead, 8 centuries of rule, 7 days of fire. But numbers do not suffer, and numbers do not fear. We must remember the individuals: the poet, Princess Fatima, the young Prince Ali, and the scholars who hid in wells, to truly comprehend the cost of this collapse. The end of a civilization is not a single moment of collapse. It is a chain of irreparable breakdowns, each making the next more inevitable. After the symbolic heart of the world was crushed in that palace throne room, the killing became routine, and the destruction of knowledge became a science. The fall of Baghdad stands as an eternal warning to all civilizations, regardless of how wealthy or technologically sophisticated they may be. Vigilance, wisdom, and the courage to face hard truths are the only true defenses against the darkness that humans are capable of creating. Disaster often begins not with a loud alarm, but with a subtle absence, like the silencing of the fountains in a palace that believed it would last forever. As we close this chapter of history, reflect on the fragility of the world we build. The libraries we treasure and the peace we enjoy are not guaranteed by tradition alone. They are preserved by our willingness to remember the past and learn from its ruins. The memory of 1258 serves as a bridge, connecting us to the voices of those who watched their world vanish in a single week. By keeping their stories alive, we ensure that their suffering was not in vain, and that the lessons of the fall remain accessible to all who seek to build a more resilient future.